Imagine a planet with not one kind of human, but at least six. Picture a world where our ancestors shared the Earth with other human species, some taller, some stockier, some with larger brains than our own. Around 100,000 years ago, if you had wandered the ancient world, you might have met Neanderthals hunting mammoths in the frozen valleys of Europe, or the tiny Homo floresiensis, no bigger than a modern child, surviving on a remote Indonesian island. Humanity was not a single story, but a branching bush of possibilities. And yet today, only one of those species remains. Us. Homo sapiens. The wise human, or so we named ourselves. How did we do it? How did a rather unremarkable ape from the savannas of East Africa, an animal that sat somewhere in the middle of the food chain, terrified of larger predators, scavenging bone marrow left behind by lions, come to dominate the entire planet, split the atom, walk on the moon, and start to tinker with the very code of life itself? That is the enormous question at the heart of Yuval Noah Harari's book Sapiens. It is a story that spans roughly 70,000 years, and it is a story that will leave you looking at your morning coffee, your money, your nation, and even your own sense of self in a completely different light. Because Harari argues that almost everything you believe is real, laws, gods, corporations, human rights, even money itself, exists first and foremost as a story we all agreed to tell. And it was our unique talent for believing in shared stories that turned a frightened ape into the ruler of the world. Yuval Noah Harari is an Israeli historian who trained at Oxford and teaches at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He originally specialized in medieval military history, the world of knights and crusades, but he became famous for something far more ambitious. Sapiens, first published in Hebrew in 2011 and in English in 2014, is what we might call big history. Instead of focusing on a single era or a single nation, Harari attempts to compress the entire span of the human species into a single, flowing narrative, weaving together biology, anthropology, economics, and philosophy. The book became a global phenomenon, translated into dozens of languages and championed by figures ranging from Barack Obama to Bill Gates. Part of its appeal is Harari's willingness to be provocative. He is not content to simply recount what happened. He wants to unsettle you. He will tell you that the agricultural revolution, which we usually celebrate as the dawn of civilization, was actually a catastrophe for the individual human being. He will tell you that wheat domesticated us rather than the other way around. He will suggest that money and religion are cut from the same imaginative cloth. He writes with a cool, almost detached wit, the kind of voice that enjoys puncturing our comfortable assumptions. It is worth saying at the outset that Sapiens is not without its critics. Some historians and scientists have argued that Harari sometimes overstates his case, glosses over academic debates, or presents contested theories as settled fact. He paints in very broad strokes, and broad strokes inevitably blur the details. But even his critics tend to admit that the book is a magnificent conversation starter. It asks the biggest possible questions about who we are and how we got here, and it does so in a way that ordinary readers can follow. So let us walk through Harari's grand narrative, keeping in mind that this is one historian's bold interpretation rather than a final verdict. Harari begins by knocking humanity off its pedestal. For most of our existence, he reminds us, humans were entirely unremarkable. We appeared in East Africa a few million years ago as one primate among many. Our early ancestors were weak. We had no claws, no fangs, no thick hide, and no great speed. We were not the apex predators we imagine ourselves to be. In fact, Harari makes the striking point that humans spent a very long time in the middle of the food chain, hunting small creatures and gathering what we could, while living in genuine terror of the lions and hyenas that could kill us. Our one advantage was a large brain, which is metabolically expensive and demanded enormous amounts of energy. It is a curious puzzle why evolution invested so heavily in such a costly organ for so long without an obvious payoff. Harari suggests that we may have first used our intelligence in a rather grim way, as scavengers, cracking open bones to eat the marrow that stronger predators could not reach. We were the cleanup crew of the savanna, not its kings. Then, according to Harari, our ancestors made a series of leaps. The mastery of fire was enormous. Fire gave a small, weak animal access to a source of energy that could reshape the landscape, ward off predators, and, crucially, cook food. Cooking allowed us to eat a wider range of foods and to digest them more efficiently, which some scientists believe helped fuel the growth of our brains and shorten our intestines. But even with fire, humans were still just one clever animal among several human species. The truly decisive change was still to come, and it happened inside our heads. The turning point in Harari's story is what he calls the cognitive revolution, which he dates to roughly 70,000 years ago. Something changed in the wiring of the sapiens' brain, perhaps a chance genetic mutation, and it gave us a new kind of language. Now, many animals have forms of communication. Monkeys can cry out to warn of a lion. Bees can dance to indicate where flowers grow. So, what made human language so special? Harari offers two answers, and the second is the heart of his entire book. The first is that our language became astonishingly flexible. We could combine a limited set of sounds into an infinite number of sentences, allowing us to absorb, store, and communicate vast quantities of information about the world. We could gossip. And Harari takes gossip seriously. He argues that the ability to talk about other people, who is trustworthy, who is a cheat, who is sleeping with whom, allowed early humans to cooperate in larger and more sophisticated groups. Trust is the glue of cooperation, and gossip is how you decide whom to trust. But there is a natural ceiling to a society held together by gossip and personal acquaintance. Sociologists suggest that the maximum number of individuals a human can know intimately enough to gossip about hovers around 150. Beyond that number, groups tend to fracture. So how did humans eventually build cities of millions and empires spanning continents, when we are biologically suited to bands of a few dozen? This is where Harari's most powerful idea arrives. The truly unique feature of our language is not that it lets us describe the real world of lions and rivers. It is that it lets us talk about things that do not exist at all. We can tell stories about gods, spirits, ancestors, and imaginary beings. We can create fictions. No other animal can do this. You can never convince a monkey to hand over its banana by promising it limitless bananas in monkey heaven after it dies. But humans will do the equivalent all the time. We will sacrifice, work, fight, and die for stories. And this ability to create and believe in shared fictions is, in Harari's telling, the secret of our success. Fiction allowed large numbers of strangers to cooperate effectively by believing in the same myths. Two Catholics who have never met can go on a crusade together because they both believe in the same God and the same sacred stories. Two lawyers who have never met can defend a stranger because they both believe in the existence of laws, justice, and human rights. None of these things exist in the way that rivers and trees exist. They exist in our collective imagination. And that, Harari says, is a superpower. It let us adjust our behavior rapidly, change our social arrangements without waiting for genetic evolution, and cooperate in numbers that no other species could ever match. Harari extends this idea into one of the book's central concepts, which he calls the imagined order. An imagined order is a set of shared beliefs that structures a society, beliefs about hierarchy, value, rights, and rules. The crucial point is that these orders are not objective truths written into the fabric of the universe. They're inventions sustained purely by collective belief. And yet they are not lies, exactly, because they genuinely shape reality once enough people believe in them. Consider money. A dollar bill is a worthless piece of paper, or today, just a number on a screen. It has value only because we all agree it has value and trust that others will accept it tomorrow. Money is perhaps the most successful story ever told, because it is a system of mutual trust so universal that it can bridge cultures, religions, and languages that agree on almost nothing else. A devout believer and a committed atheist, sworn enemies in matters of faith, will happily trade using the same coins. Harari calls money the most universal and most efficient system of mutual trust ever devised. Consider the corporation. A company like a car manufacturer is a legal fiction. It is not the factory, not the workers, not the executives, not even the products. It is an imagined entity, conjured into existence by lawyers reciting the right legal formulas that can own property, sue, and be sued as if it were a person. Harari playfully compares this to a priest conjuring a spirit. The lawyer conjures a corporation, and suddenly millions of dollars flow through something that has no physical body at all. And consider human rights. Harari makes the deliberately unsettling observation that if you dissect a human being, you will find no organ of rights, no molecule of liberty, no gene for equality. From a strictly biological standpoint, humans are not created equal, and there is no cosmic law guaranteeing anyone freedom. These are not scientific facts, they are values we have collectively chosen to believe in and to build our societies around. Harari is not saying we should abandon them. His point is subtler and more important. These fictions are what hold our civilization together, and they are astonishingly effective precisely because we treat them as real. An imagined order works best when we forget that we imagined it, and instead believe it was decreed by the gods or written into nature. Now, this idea is one of the places where Harari has drawn criticism. Some argue that lumping money, laws, gods, and nations together as mere fictions flattens important distinctions, and that many of these institutions rest on real material foundations and hard-won practical logic, not just belief. It is a fair objection. But the core insight remains genuinely illuminating. Much of what governs our daily lives is a shared story, and stories can be rewritten. For tens of thousands of years after the cognitive revolution, humans lived as foragers, hunters and gatherers roaming the land in small bands. Harari devotes real attention to this way of life, and here he offers another provocation. He suggests that the forager era may have been, in some respects, the most affluent and satisfying period in human history. Foragers enjoyed a varied diet, worked fewer hours than later farmers, suffered less from infectious disease, and possessed a broad range of skills and knowledge about the natural world. They were, he argues, physically and mentally more versatile than most of their descendants. He is careful not to romanticize them completely. Their lives could be violent and harsh, but he wants to shatter the assumption that our ancestors lived lives of unrelenting misery from which civilization rescued us. Then, around 12,000 years ago, came the agricultural revolution. Humans in a few regions began to domesticate plants and animals, wheat, rice, maize, sheep, goats, cattle. We settled down, built villages, and began to farm. This is the moment we usually celebrate as the Great Leap Forward, the birth of civilization. And Harari drops his most famous bombshell. He calls the agricultural revolution history's biggest fraud. Why a fraud? Because, he argues, it did not improve the lives of ordinary individuals. In many ways, it made them worse. The average farmer worked harder than the average forager and often ended up with a less nutritious diet, dependent on a narrow range of crops. Farmers bent their spines over fields, developed slipped discs and arthritis, and suffered new ailments born of repetitive labor. Living packed together with animals and other people, in permanent settlements surrounded by their own waste, they became vulnerable to epidemics. And a society dependent on a single harvest was exposed to famine whenever the crop failed. So if farming made individuals miserable, why did it triumph? Harari's answer flips our usual perspective. He suggests that from an evolutionary standpoint, success is measured not in the happiness of individuals, but in the number of copies of DNA. And on that measure, agriculture was a spectacular success. Farming produces far more food per acre than foraging, which means it can support far larger populations. The total number of humans exploded. But those extra people lived worse lives, crammed into a struggle for survival. Evolution, Harari reminds us with characteristic bluntness, does not care about our suffering. Then comes his most memorable inversion. We like to say that we domesticated wheat. Harari suggests we consider the possibility that wheat domesticated us. 10,000 years ago, wheat was just a wild grass confined to a small region of the Middle East. Today, it covers vast stretches of the planet. From the wheat plant's evolutionary point of view, this is a triumph beyond imagining, and it was achieved by manipulating Homo sapiens into serving its needs. We cleared fields for it, watered it, protected it from pests, and defended it, bending our bodies and reshaping our entire way of life around the needs of a grass. The word domesticate comes from the Latin for house, and Harari asks, who really moved into whose house? We imagine ourselves as the masters, but a case can be made that we became servants of the crops we planted. Harari's deeper point is that the agricultural revolution created a trap. Once populations grew and people settled into farming villages, there was no going back. A larger population could not survive by returning to foraging. Each small decision, plant a few more seeds, store a little more grain, have another child because there is food to feed it, seemed sensible in the moment. But collectively, generation by generation, these choices locked humanity into a way of life that was harder and more anxious than what came before. We were pursuing an easier life, and we ended up multiplying our labors and our worries. It is a sobering thought about progress, and it echoes throughout the rest of his book. The sum of small, reasonable steps can lead an entire species somewhere no individual ever chose to go. After agriculture came the slow, uneven process that Harari calls the unification of humankind. For most of history, the world was a patchwork of thousands of separate cultures, tribes, and small societies, each isolated in its own little universe. Over the centuries, these fragments were gradually stitched together into larger and larger units, until eventually the entire planet became a single interconnected world. Harari identifies three great forces that drove this unification, three universal orders that could bind together people who had never met and who otherwise shared nothing. The first is money, which we have already touched on. Money is the most universal of the three because it requires no shared language, no shared god, no shared homeland. It requires only trust in the currency itself. A merchant in one land and a merchant in another can trade even if they cannot understand each other's speech or stomach each other's beliefs, because gold and silver, coins and credit, are understood everywhere. Money creates a kind of universal solvent that dissolves the barriers between cultures. But Harari notes a shadow side. Money can also corrode other values, reducing everything loyalty, community, the sacred to a price. The second force is empire. We tend to think of empires as purely evil engines of conquest, oppression, and exploitation. And they certainly were violent and unjust. But Harari asks us to consider their role in unification with cold honesty. Empires swallowed up countless small cultures and fused them into larger civilizations. They spread languages, laws, technologies, and ideas across vast territories. The very concept of a universal order, the idea that a single system of rule and culture could and should encompass all of humanity, was cultivated by empires. Many of the cultural achievements we cherish were produced by, or funded by, imperial power, often built on the suffering of the conquered. Harari does not ask us to admire empires. He asks us to recognize that the world we inhabit, with its dominant languages and shared cultural frameworks, is very largely their legacy, for better and for worse. The third force is religion, and by religion Harari means something broad, any system of norms and values founded on a belief in a superhuman order. Religions, especially the great universal and missionary religions, made a revolutionary claim that there is a single truth valid for all people everywhere, and that this truth should be spread to all of humanity. This universalizing impulse helped bind strangers into vast communities of shared belief. And here Harari makes another of his provocative moves. He argues that in the modern age, new belief systems have taken on the functions of traditional religion. Ideologies like liberalism, nationalism, and communism, he suggests, are effectively religions in this broad sense, because they too rest on unprovable beliefs about value and order, and they too command devotion, sacrifice, and faith. Even humanism, the belief in the sacredness and supreme worth of humanity itself, is, in his framing, a kind of religion, one that has quietly replaced the worship of gods with the worship of man. Taken together, money, empire, and religion pushed human history in a single direction, toward global integration. Harari is careful to say this was not inevitable and not the product of any master plan. But looking back across the millennia, the trend is unmistakable. The many became one. The final great turning point in Harari's narrative is the scientific revolution, which began roughly 500 years ago in Europe and utterly transformed the human condition. Harari's account of it is one of the most interesting parts of the book because he locates the revolution not in a particular discovery, but in a change of attitude. What made modern science possible, he argues, was the willingness to admit ignorance. For most of history, human beings assumed that all the important knowledge about the world was already contained in their sacred traditions. If the answer was not in the holy books or the ancient wisdom, then it was not worth knowing, or it belonged only to the gods. Science began when people started to say, openly, we do not know. They admitted that their traditions might be incomplete or wrong, that there were vast territories of ignorance to be explored, and that new knowledge could be gained by observation, experiment, and mathematics. This humility was radical. It meant that the present could surpass the past, that the future could hold discoveries the ancients never dreamed of, and that progress was possible. Along with this admission of ignorance came a new confidence in the power of knowledge to grant us new abilities. Science and technology fused. People began to believe that by investigating nature, we could gain power over it, cure diseases, increase crops, build machines, and defeat problems that had plagued humanity forever. Knowledge became power in the most literal sense. But Harari insists that science did not advance on curiosity alone. Science is expensive. Someone has to pay for the ships, the laboratories, the expeditions, and the scholars. And so he traces a powerful feedback loop between three forces: science, empire, and capitalism. European empires funded scientific expeditions because knowledge of geography, botany, and navigation helped them conquer and control distant lands. Scientists, in turn, gave the empires the tools of domination: better maps, better weapons, better medicine. And capitalism provided the financial engine that drove the whole enterprise forward. This alliance of curiosity, conquest, and capital is, for Harari, the distinctive signature of the modern world. Harari devotes special attention to capitalism because he sees it not merely as an economic system, but as something closer to a belief system, even an ethic, that reshaped human values. At the core of capitalism is a simple and revolutionary idea: the belief in growth. For most of history, people assumed that the total amount of wealth in the world was more or less fixed. If you wanted more, someone else had to have less. The economic pie was a fixed size. Capitalism shattered that assumption by introducing the concept of credit. Credit, Harari explains, is essentially trust in the future. When a bank lends money it does not physically possess, it is betting that the future will be richer than the present, that the borrowed money will be invested, generate profit, and be repaid with interest. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Belief in growth generates credit, credit funds enterprise, enterprise generates growth, and growth justifies more credit. The economy expands because we collectively believe it will, and we act on that belief. It is, once again, a story we tell that becomes true because we all believe it. The engine of the modern world runs on faith in tomorrow. This faith unleashed extraordinary productivity and lifted enormous numbers of people out of the poverty and precariousness that defined most of human history. Harari does not deny the material triumphs of the modern age, but he also draws attention to their dark underside. The same drive for profit and growth that built our prosperity also fueled some of history's greatest crimes. The Atlantic slave trade, he reminds us, was driven not by ancient hatred, but by cold economic calculation and the pursuit of returns for investors. The colonization and exploitation of much of the world was, in large part, a business venture. Capitalism, like the forces before it, is a tool of immense power that has produced both extraordinary good and extraordinary suffering, often at the same time. And Harari points to a tension at the heart of the modern economy. Capitalism demands endless growth and endless consumption. It rests on an ethic that encourages the rich to invest and the rest of us to buy, to consume, to always want more. Yet we live on a finite planet with finite resources. The engine that has powered our rise may be running against natural limits it was never designed to respect. This tension between infinite growth and a finite world is one of the great, unresolved questions his narrative leaves hanging over our future. Having carried us through 70,000 years of history, Harari pauses to ask a question that most history books ignore entirely. Through all of this, the conquests, the revolutions, the inventions, the vast increase in human power, did we actually become happier? We are far richer, far healthier, and far more powerful than our ancestors. We have conquered famine, plague, and much of the violence that shadowed earlier ages. But are we more content? Harari finds this a genuinely difficult question, and he refuses to give an easy answer. He points out that historians rarely study happiness, and that our tools for measuring it are crude. But he raises the real possibility that all our material progress may not have translated into greater well-being. The medieval peasant, embedded in a tight community and a shared web of meaning, may have felt more secure and more anchored than the modern individual, who enjoys unprecedented comfort and freedom, but often feels isolated, anxious, and adrift. He explores several angles on happiness. From a biological view, our sense of well-being is regulated by internal chemistry that tends to return to a baseline, no matter what happens to us. Win the lottery or suffer a tragedy, and after a while your happiness drifts back toward where it started. This suggests that external conditions matter far less to our contentment than we assume, which would explain why centuries of improving conditions have not made us dramatically happier. He also considers the idea, drawn from certain philosophical and religious traditions, that happiness comes not from getting what we crave, but from understanding the nature of our own cravings, that the endless pursuit of pleasure and achievement may itself be the trap. And he raises the possibility that happiness depends on meaning, on believing that our lives serve some larger purpose, even if that purpose is, once again, a story we tell ourselves. The unsettling conclusion is that we have become extraordinarily powerful, but we are not at all sure that we have become wiser or happier. We have gained the whole world, in a sense, and we are not certain what it has done for our souls. It is a rare and valuable question for a history book to ask, and Harari's willingness to leave it open, rather than forcing a tidy answer, is one of the book's real strengths. Harari closes his sweeping story by turning to the future, and here the tone shifts from historical to almost prophetic. For 4 billion years, he observes, life on Earth evolved according to the blind laws of natural selection. No organism could escape the rules of that game. Now, for the first time, one species, us, is beginning to break those rules and to replace natural selection with intelligent design of our own making. He points to 3 technologies that could transform not just our world, but our very nature. The first is biological engineering, our growing ability to deliberately alter the genes and bodies of living things, including ourselves. The second is the merging of the biological with the mechanical, the rise of cyborgs, of bodies enhanced and extended by machines and implants. The third is the creation of entirely inorganic life, the possibility of artificial intelligence and non-organic beings that could think, learn, and perhaps surpass us. Through these paths, Harari suggests, Homo sapiens may be approaching the end of its own story, not through extinction by catastrophe, but by transforming itself into something altogether new and possibly unrecognizable. He invokes the ancient Sumerian tale of Gilgamesh, the king who searched desperately for the secret of immortality, to name what he calls the great project of modern science, the attempt to conquer death itself. For our ancestors, death was an inescapable fact of the cosmic order. For a growing number of scientists and entrepreneurs today, death is being reframed as merely a technical problem, and technical problems are things we solve. Whether or not we ever defeat death, the ambition itself marks a staggering shift in how our species sees its place in the universe. And so Harari ends on a note that is equal parts wonder and warning. We are, he suggests, on the verge of acquiring the powers that we once attributed only to gods, the power to create and destroy life, to design new beings, to reshape the world according to our desires. We are becoming self-made gods. But he leaves us with a deeply uncomfortable observation. We are gods who do not know what we want. We wield ever greater power, yet we remain unsure of our goals, dissatisfied with what we have, and largely irresponsible with the abilities we possess. Is there anything, he asks, more dangerous than dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who do not know what they want? On that haunting question, his History of Humankind comes to rest. Let me draw together the threads of Harari's grand argument, because beneath the sweep of the story lie a handful of ideas worth carrying with you. The first and most important is the power of shared fiction. What makes humans unique is not our intelligence alone, but our ability to invent and believe in stories, gods, nations, money, laws, corporations, rights. These imagined orders let millions of strangers cooperate flexibly, and they are the true foundation of everything we call civilization. Once you see this, you cannot unsee it. The structures that feel most solid and permanent in your life are, at bottom, agreements we have all chosen to honor. The second takeaway is that progress has a hidden cost, and it does not always serve the individual. The agricultural revolution multiplied our numbers while often diminishing the quality of individual lives. Growth in power, wealth, and population does not automatically translate into growth in human well-being. We should be suspicious of the easy equation between more and better. The third is that the forces that unified humanity and built the modern world, money, empire, capitalism, and science, are tools of extraordinary and morally ambiguous power. They produced both our greatest achievements and our greatest atrocities, frequently intertwined. History is not a simple tale of good progress overcoming bad ignorance. It is messier and more honest than that. The fourth is the neglected question of happiness. For all our conquests, we have little evidence that we are more content than our distant ancestors. Power and meaning are not the same thing, and a species that gains the one while losing the other has not necessarily won. And the fifth is that we now stand at a genuinely unprecedented moment. For the first time, a living species is beginning to take control of its own evolution and to reach for godlike powers. What we do with those powers, and whether we can figure out what we actually want before we wield them, may be the most consequential question our species has ever faced. Sapiens is, in the end, a book about perspective. It takes the familiar furniture of our world, our money, our nations, our beliefs, our sense of being the natural rulers of the earth, and it makes all of it strange again. It reminds us that we are a very young species, an accident of biology and imagination that rose from the middle of the food chain to the top with startling speed, dragging the rest of the living world along with us. It asks us to hold two truths at once, that we are astonishingly powerful and that we barely understand ourselves. You do not have to agree with every one of Harari's provocations. His broad strokes sometimes flatten the details, and serious scholars have pushed back on parts of his account. But that, I think, is beside the point of why the book matters. Its value lies in the questions it forces you to ask. What stories am I living inside without noticing? What do I mistake for natural law that is really just a shared agreement? Has all our progress actually made us happier or merely busier? And now that we are gaining the power to redesign life itself, do we have the wisdom to know what we should want? These are the questions Harari leaves ringing in your ears long after you close the book. He offers no comforting resolution, and that is fitting, because the story of Sapiens is still being written by us right now, with every choice we make about the powers we are only beginning to grasp. We are the storytelling animal, the species that conquered the world by believing in things that do not exist. The question that remains is what new story we will choose to tell next, and whether it will be one wise enough to be worthy of the enormous power now resting in our hands. That is the challenge Sapiens hands to each of us, and it is why, more than a decade after it appeared, people are still arguing about it, still unsettled by it, and still, unmistakably, changed by it.